Well, a number of senior Indigenous leaders have spoken out in the wake of October's failed Voice to Parliament referendum. This week, Professor Marcia Langton, one of the architects of the Voice to Parliament design, told the Financial Review that regional and local voice representation should have been legislated before the referendum and that the loss of bipartisanship destroyed the chances of success.
Then on Friday, Mick Gooder, co-chair of the Queensland Interim Truth and Treaty Body, blamed the referendum's failure on a crash-through or crash approach and said it should have been legislated as well. Ken Wyatt is a former Coalition Minister for Indigenous Australians who was a member of the referendum working group. He quit the Liberal Party over its decision to oppose the Voice to Parliament. Ken Wyatt joins us now. Good morning. Thanks for your company.
Good morning, Dan. It's great to be with you.
Ken, was it a mistake for the government to proceed when it was clear that that bipartisanship was lost from the Nationals and the Liberal Party?
Look, I'll go back to what I was going to do. I was going to legislate local and regional voices to allay fears and for a wedge not to be driven through a great concept of local voices determining their future. And in hindsight, we can now say, yes, it should have been legislated, and I do hope that the Prime Minister's government will consider those options, because that is where we have to listen and make changes in order to tackle the targets that have been agreed to by every state and territory government, including local government.
Yeah, I want to come back to those targets in a moment, but particularly I just want to stick on the legislating, because that was one of the key recommendations of the Karma Langton report, although that report did acknowledge that it wasn't able to look at constitutional recognition, which came up in many of those recommendations. Professor Marcia Langton did tell the very first formal meeting of the referendum working group that the legislation needed to be drafted and tabled before the referendum. I understand that you were there. Why wasn't that taken on board?
It's obviously a decision made by governments of the day. It's a pity it wasn't taken on board, because we would have made significant gains. And I suspect that the fear-mongering would have been allayed, because the voice locally is pivotal. And it's a pity that government did not take that proposition forward that Marcia and others around the table put forward.
Why do you think they didn't take that on when it was raised in that report and then raised at that very first meeting by Professor Langton?
Look, I think there was already a predetermined pathway into which we were providing input. The joining of the two questions should have been debated much more, because I think that recognition would have been supported by Australians, but the voice certainly, as evident, wouldn't have been. But it would have been a step closer to achieving the outcomes that those three reference groups I established, which included their report, focused on having local and regional legislated voices, and the regional voices would choose the national representatives, not the Canberra elites, not politicians.
And there's been much discussion about the government and whether or not there will be a fulfilment of the rest of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is treaty, makarata or truth-telling. Now, you've made comments saying really, or that at least you're reported of being saying that makarata commission should be off the table. Where are you standing on this?
Look, I think the whole issue of truth-telling is important. But what I want to see happen now is for governments to focus exclusively on the targets, because I'm tired of still seeing people die young, the high incarceration rates, and the many other foibles that create the gaps that are going to be there in perpetuity. We will never close the gaps if we do not collectively as a nation put into practice what communities are asking for at the local level on each of those targets. Bureaucracies do their job, but they do not power share, and they do not sit and co-design or work through issues at the local and regional levels. That's where it has to happen. And Makarrata Commission can come later, because agreement making is a principle of the Makarrata Commission, but that's already being undertaken by states and territories. Truth-telling, there has to be mechanisms around that. You can't rely exclusively on school curriculum, because there have always been changes every time there's a change of government. So we need some other consistent approaches. And I really love the work that Rachel Perkins did with the Frontier Wars, the 3 documentaries. They were very powerful, based on evidence, based on fact. And that's what the Makarrata Commission should be doing, and when it arises.
Look, Ken, just finally, on the Closing the Gap, the report that came out in just the last couple of weeks found just 4 targets are on track, 11 targets are improving, 4 targets of children's early development, rates of children in out-of-home care, adult imprisonment and suicide are actually getting worse. The government announced re-announced more than $700 million spend on new jobs, remote training, justice, and an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children's Commissioner. If it's become too fraught for the Commonwealth to look at local and regional bodies, and that in fact becomes the work of the states and territories, what do you think is the role of the government then in closing that gap? Keeping in mind the Productivity Commission pointed out the exact point you're making about the lack of power sharing.
Well, Commonwealth has still got an important and pivotal role in local and regional decision making. They should not walk away from that. You want a consistent model across the nation, but you want state and territory governments totally committed to the way in which that is done. But if change is to occur, and you've mentioned 4 of the worst, but there's another one, education, that I think we have to do more digging into. What we have to ask the question of is how many Aboriginal children enrol in Year 1 who complete Year 7, and of that figure of early enrolment, how many make Year 10, and not base the succession in education based on 10 to 12 and tertiary pathways. We have to think of all those kids dropping out who become part of the behaviour that results in incarceration. So there's a lot of detailed work to be done, and states hold authority for most of those targets.
Former Indigenous Australians Minister Ken Wyatt, thank you for your time and particularly getting up so early this morning.
That's not a problem, Dan. It's good to be with you.